So Michael has joined me again for one of our Friday fireside chats. Well, we record these on Friday. I usually air them on Wednesday. So we're recording on a Friday. You'll probably see this next Wednesday. Uh, we've been talking about David Bentley Hart's book, Ye Are Gods, and we've been kind of working our way through the last essay in that book, which is called Chiasmus. And we got about 12, we got to about bullet point 12 of the 30 some odd bullet points
Yeah, that was the
in that
last one.
essay, and we kind of agreed that we would pick back up where we left off, which was with number 12. Unless there's anything that, like, is there anything that you've seen on the channel lately that you wanted to chime in on in addition to this? Because I don't want to just limit it to only that as the only legitimate avenue for conversation. So what's on your mind, Michael?
Man, we could talk about anything. We could,
right, exactly.
We could talk about Roe v. Wade. We wanted to like.
Do you want to
piss off 50%?
What are your thoughts? Let's address it. What are your thoughts?
I honestly don't know. Like I was raised. This is such a fire red hot issue, and always has been. In the political sense, I was raised in a home where pro-life was held up as like the most important issue of our time. So like my mom would like go into classrooms with like little baby fetuses, like plastic versions to show kids like, oh, this is what the baby looks like at this age, and those sorts of things. And so like I'm very shaped by that, but I've also have all these thoughts about the way in which that particular issue has been weaponized by the right and the left as like ways to secure votes. And so like I don't like, in my mind, it's like this morass of different things. Like I have like a million different competing like ideas in my head about how it should be handled. And I don't know, I can argue for almost anybody's position on it, and I understand why it's so important to them. But yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think that the way that it's been for my entire lifetime, it's been this like culture war divide that has tended toward extreme in the
there's no
political
nuance.
dialogue.
You can't touch it without being branded by one or the other sides as being just a morally repugnant person for having the wrong opinion.
But then when you talk to actual humans, right? When you talk to actual humans who are just like, regular folks, almost no one has a position that is representative of the like extremes that you see on both sides. Like almost no one actually thinks that having like abortion on demand at any stage of pregnancy without any kind of limitation is a positive moral good. No actual person I know holds that position.
Yeah.
Even though there are people who will politically hold that position because of some kind of slippery slope argument or something like that. Neither do I know anyone who believes that that abortion should never occur under any possible foreseeable circumstances ever. Like I don't know anyone who holds that position either. So it seems like, I don't know, in some ways the court kicking the issue back to the states to legislate sensibly about is probably a good thing. Although I don't know if we're capable of having an adult nuanced conversation on anything anymore.
Yeah, like I'm of the opinion that a decentralized approach to most things is better. But
obviously
it seems like the states are, you just see what kind of legislation is coming out of the states lately, and it just seems like it's particularly written to just add fuel to the fire in terms of the political, like it's like trying to get their name. Like all these local politicians want to get their name into the national dialogue because that will project them into the next level of
so
money,
even
success, and influence.
So even the motive for passing legislation is not anymore. It's not even Well, first of all, the consideration as to whether the legislation actually is passable or not, it doesn't enter into it, right? And then it doesn't even enter into the thinking whether it's good policy or not. It
Yeah,
just becomes like whether having my name associated with this legislation going to advance my own political career seems to be the primary motivation for almost everything that gets introduced.
it's crazy. It's like, will this let me raise more money or not? End of story. Period. Full stop. You know, and that sounds really cynical, but like what happens is if you don't do that as a politician, you get out competed by the person that does raise more money. So, and there's so many, you know, anyway, I don't want to derail into politics here because it's
No,
like
I just
US
want to look
politics
for
is
it
such
really
a
quick. There was
depressing.
like, I thought, David, because we're talking about David Bentley Hart's book, David Bentley Hart's brother, Robert, had a fantastic post on the Fans of David Bentley Hart page. Let me see if I can find it
On this particular issue or just
on
politics?
this particular issue that I thought was just like very clear headed. Must have been. Yeah. I knew that I sent it to my wife and I thought I could find it in my messages, but
Yeah, something clear
I
headed
can't
would
find it. But
be
it was really good. And essentially I can kind of summarize, and it aligned very much with where I stand on it. I mean, first of all, I'm a Christian anarchist, so I'm not really much in favor of um of the sword or government coercion of any kind. So there's that. I mean, I think it's wrong,
Mhm.
unambiguously wrong. In my but there are certain kinds of wrongs that it's absolutely silly to legislate
Mhm.
about. Like I think adultery is unambiguously wrong too, but to make adultery a crime
Yeah.
that is enforceable through the
Well,
law.
it's all about this issue of like, at what point does the unborn child, is it should it could be considered, to have some rights? Like, I think I don't think anybody would think that it doesn't shouldn't have some rights. Like the idea, like I just had a son in the last year and a half, and the idea that somebody could the day before their child is due walk into the doctor and be like, oh, I don't want it. I think most people would say, yeah, that's not morally right. There's something there that
Right, right. Most people
deserves a
would. Although, is that really
yeah.
the case anymore? Because it seems like some of the more progressive states have like notably California have like kind of like responded to this in the absolute frenzy that's developed. This is like there's really kind of a psychosis going on over this. And the legislation that they were talking about introducing would effectively have made infanticide legal.
Oh, really? I didn't heard about that.
So um so just doubling down on a bad thing
Yeah, yeah, that's
over ideology.
I can't imagine that, like that has to backfire, right? Because like I can't imagine if you create a diverse sampling of the US population or even the California population and ask them, hey, do you think this is right? I think most people
Right.
would just
Right.
instinctually at a gut level,
Most
people
people
would
know
say
it's wrong. And I
no.
would say that most people who are being honest are really well are would also say that, you know what, like our social safety net kind of sucks. And we have a lot of people or children that are being born into really terrible situations
Yeah.
because we don't have supports in place that are anywhere remotely adequate. So there's like it's so many it doesn't I don't see this yeah, I don't it's not a fix for anything. Even though morally I agree it was the right decision and legally I agree it was the right decision.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a great blessing. I think we've got more I think it's just going to create more ugliness ahead.
It does feel like a match lit to something, but yeah.
Yeah, yes, yes. The whole point. It's like this whole country was already a powder keg, like just waiting to go off, and it definitely feels like a lit match,
Yeah.
no doubt about it. And I don't know. I mean, I don't vote, so it's not on me. So I don't really.
Yeah, it's strange. I have the same set of kind of intuitions that, yeah, like in terms of the legal interpretation, I think they're probably on the right track. And I do think that the justices that wrote the opinion were really very careful in terms of trying to parse this at a legal level. I don't think that they were,
Right.
you know, and I do think that there's something, right about what they're doing. But at the same time, I just have this like sort of like other gut reaction that like this is the start of something that's not so great. Um, but I mean, that's just my intuitions. I couldn't justify those.
There's a kind of like on the right, you can see that there's a little bit of like the kind of like the same kind of mentality that took over the left with the coronavirus.
Mhm,
There's a little bit of this kind of like idolatry of life, as in the terms of life as a resource that we can manage,
mhm,
that Yvonne Illich talked about, that you can see kind of in the right's abortion response, because it does. And I think it happens because of the fact that it uses it as a political cudgel and for the purposes of gaining power.
mhm. Yeah,
So there's plenty of darkness all around. It's not gonna, and it's, but I think it's unambiguously morally wrong. I'll say that without any qualms.
yeah.
Um,
So do you
so
see any obvious segues between this and what we're talking about with being and grace and supernature and all
well,
this?
that section he was talking about, I I just kind of glanced over it really quickly before we started, and I was a little bit hesitant to dive into it at the end of our last session because
It's so
it's
involved.
it's involved some pretty complicated issues. And the first thing it's dealing with is like this idea uh of of potency and act, and um uh necessity and contingency, and the meaning of the divine freedom in relation to that necessity.
Yeah,
So I would say, in as much as he's talking about freedom, that it does touch on this, because
yeah,
that's kind of how it gets. Both sides are actually kind of, it's a free, like it's the right to exist, or the right to life, right? And it's cast in this rights language. It's very Enlightenment rights
mm,
language.
yeah,
And on one side, and on the other side, it's pro-choice. So clearly the language of like freedom, and definitely it's a freedom in a very libertarian sense. And I think when people, and I think to like, part of why people would resist this idea, um some of what Hart is saying here, is that they think that it's an affront to God's freedom,
right.
right? Because Hart at sometimes in this essay seems to imply that creation is simply a necessary manifestation of God's nature. Like that's what,
Right.
right? And his argument here at the beginning is that God's not being a finite being makes that kind of modal logic that we're trying to apply there not really hold sway. That's in the very opening
Yeah.
of that. So
And also I think that a lot hinges on the definition of this word freedom, which I think there's a big distinction between the kind of classic definition of that word being like a freedom to be aligned to the good, the true, the beautiful, which is conceived of as being the most unhindered, versus what we mean today oftentimes when we use the word, which is this sort of voluntaristic, like being able to do whatever you want, like in a sort of like, having more possibilities, and like if I had a billion possibilities, I'm more free than if I had a million possibilities. And that's kind of how we think about freedom.
Well, I would say that there, but here's the thing though, and I would say, well, I would say there's also the, just like, there's a kind of like existential freedom too. Like anything, nothing can really exist properly unless it's free. Otherwise, it doesn't really have its own existence. Its existence is dependent on another. And I think this is related to the freedom. This is related to the freedom of love, but the freedom of the freedom of love always already implies the potential to not choose it
Right.
as
Well,
well.
yeah. So this is weird though, because I mean, so like when you use freedom there, it sounds like you're alluding more towards our modern usage of the term, where we think of freedom as a sort of independence, which I do think is absolutely true, that there has to be this level of independence for existence to have any meaningful component to it. But I don't think that's the way he's using freedom.
Well, I think you
here.
need it in both senses. I don't think you can escape it. Like, it's like you've heard me argue with Luke when Luke says that libertarian freedom does not exist.
Mhm.
I get that upsets me. It's like it's not an ultimate, but it has to exist because that kind of, well, it's not precise. I don't know if I would say it's, rather than call it libertarian freedom, let's call it existential freedom, because that's what I really
Mhm.
mean. It's
Right.
like if your existence is like, if God hasn't like gifted you an actual being that you possess for yourself in some sense, then you do not exist.
Right.
You're not actually a being.
Yeah, I agree
Now,
with that.
granted, your continuation in existence still is still contingent, and God is your ultimate source. I'm not contradicting any of that. But if you as a person actually exist as something apart from God, there has to be some kind of freedom there. Otherwise, you don't. There's
Yeah,
let me see if I can.
I don't disagree with any of that.
Okay, hold on a second. There's actually, let me see if I can find and this is me right now. This is not David. I think David would actually disagree with me and probably rather forcefully on this point. But I think that David doesn't give that kind of freedom enough importance. And let's see here. There's something I want to read from Tom Berg. Trying to, oh, come on. Where's my,
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think
go ahead.
whatever the possibility for that type of independence, I think has a very high cost to it.
Right.
Which I think is a really important part of this whole conversation as well. Like that the cost of that is so high that it becomes necessitated to the creative act itself. Like that has to be, in some sense, for this reality to lay itself out the way it does. It needs this sort of ridiculously high price, such that this independent exists at the lower sphere, lower strata of reality. Like something has to be, something very big has to be sacrificed for that
Right.
to happen. Otherwise it would all be determined from top to bottom. It would just be kind of, it wouldn't, in that sense, I think you're right in terms of saying that it wouldn't be real in some meaningful sense.
Let's see. Well, essentially, I can't find it, but I basically gave you a summary of a summary of the text. Essentially, that's the argument that Tomberg makes, is that something either something that doesn't have freedom can't really be said to exist. And I think that the whole entire purpose of creation
Hmm.
is that God has willed that there be something other than God
Right.
to reflect the beauty of the divine love. And that God is internally a relational multi-unity.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that like any of the negative things that Hart and others say about libertarian freedom, when it's taken as the ultimate, it still applies. It doesn't, like, both of these things are kind of necessarily true, because ultimately, if you don't, like, refusing to rest in God as your source and think that the the nothing is an alternative
Hmm.
is not going to you're not it's not going to free you. You'll have no real freedom.
Agreed.
So this actually has to do, let's see, I'm not being very clear here. I probably should have prepared a little more for this one, because I knew this was going to be
The sticking point.
yeah, I knew it was going to be a sticking point and a challenging one, and I'm not feeling that I'm being very articulate on this. I think I've made more sense at other times
Well,
talking about this
okay.
topic,
Well,
but
let me.
go
I
for
don't.
it.
Maybe that. Let's see if this helps make it. Where do you see the issue of you know, the problem specifically of evil getting into this?
Well, see, this is interesting.
Because I think
So
this is part and parcel for what we're discussing.
yeah, and I think I think I'm getting this more for I've been reading a lot of Bulgakov lately, and I think I'm getting this more from Bulgakov than from David, but I suspect that David would agree. And for Bulgakov, it's like it's the residue of the non-being, out of which we are
Right.
called. Like that's just because we're in the state of becoming. We're not really. So and so think about what I just said about, like, you don't really exist unless you're free, right?
Hmm.
Well, in a way, we don't really exist yet, because we are still in a state of becoming. We exist in that, like, we are some, like, that God has willed into being that which is other than God, right? There's the creation,
Hmm.
which reflects God and participates with God, and is joined to God in a multi-unity, and is moving toward being joined to God in an even deeper way. But it's still not it's not pantheism, right? It's not
Yeah.
just everything is not a part of God. If pantheism, in fact, if pantheism were true, like, you literally don't exist.
Well, it's weird. It seems like in our perspective too, it's almost like to some extent we have a difficult time knowing the good absent from observing the evil. Like we, in some sense, we can't then know the good as good until we've seen its opposite. Like we can't, like, you can't appreciate being rich unless you've been poor. You can't appreciate, having health if you've never been sick. Like you could make a million lists of those, and like for in terms of this finite experience, that seems to be true, that we in some sense can't fully know the good as good without having some personal experience of the alternative.
Did we not know the good in Eden before the fall?
Yeah, I don't. I can't
Come
even
on, Michael,
speculate.
you were there. I'm not kidding. I'm saying I think we come to know the good that we already have. I would say this. How about this, Michael? We come to know the good that we already had by experiencing its loss. This is why suffering is important.
Hmm.
And this is why there's like that deep joy that C.S. Lewis talks about. There's also there's this like there's this element, there's this sorrow element to it
Yeah,
too,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
You know, and we talk about the gift of tears. So it's like we do
Yeah.
know it,
This is
but
definitely on the right track.
we know it
But
through our loss.
but here's the
Through
funny
our
thing, right?
loss.
Well, here's the funny thing. So it's like, yeah, so the previous knowing of it was real, but it was there was something about it that was naive. And it was, and there's something fuller and deeper and richer that seems to be enabled by the loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think that's part of the meaning of the prodigal son too. Although people debate how just exactly how repentant the prodigal son was. Even if he wasn't repentant, he still knows what he lost, which is
Yeah.
why I mean which is what brings him home in the first place. So it's like it's almost like, and isn't that isn't that knowledge of what we lost, isn't that really the thing that's actually, isn't that the change, isn't that the change of orientation we need in order to point us in the right direction? Like so long as we think that we got it all figured out
Hmm.
and that everything is okay.
Yeah. Well,
And
like what you're
we're
alluding to seems
probably,
to me like it's maybe pointing at potentially why this loss is a necessary component of finitude to know the good, right? I mean, there's something about like, because there's this sort of overwhelming infinity to the good, that like that it always has a moreness that is beyond our current cognitive capacity, that we won't engage with it properly in exploring that moreness unless we have.
because we've been disconnected from the ability to experience it in its fullness,
Mhm.
which we would have had. But we know what, but we have this because because your soul was there. I mean, not your soul, your spirit, because your spirit was there in the beginning, you know it, right? And your spirit longs for what it has lost. And that's why it's this spirit that cries out. Like that's the part
Yeah.
of you that knows. And it's always trying to, the spirit is always trying to move you along the path toward reunion,
Yeah, and
which
absolutely.
has to
And
pass through death and suffering.
right, because there is this element of recognition that you have when you come in contact with it, that could only be explained as a sort of remembering.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, that's right. So we just demonstrated that the Platonic theory of knowledge was right, ultimately. At least when it comes to, I think it, and I actually think it is right when it comes to understanding like the things of the spirit, because the spirit does remember.
Yeah. Speaking of Plato, that channel, that YouTube channel I told you about, that Creative Retrieval, they just put out a few videos on Plato's Republic that are really good
Oh, cool.
for
I'll have to check it out.
yeah.
Okay, so we got sidetracked on our own thing, but that's okay. We're
Yep.
this is our
Per
conversation.
usual.
This is our conversation, and that was interesting. Do we have anything more to say about the actual text of bullet point 12, where basically, I mean, those are kind of that first paragraph was one thing, but does he say anything else of note there? Let's see.
I think 13 is actually a further reiteration set slash diving deeper into the same issue.
Yeah,
So
well,
I
he
think,
says, yeah, right, because yeah, and he indicates that with his vita infra at the end of 12.
yeah.
So, is I think that it's my turn, right? You did. Is that right?
You're odd, yeah.
Yeah, I'm the odd. I'm odd. Lucky number 13. Okay, here we go. We're changing. We're in a new subheading now. We're in 4, the chiasmus of the spirit. Um, he's going to list a whole bunch of passages of scripture here. Do we want to just let our audience look those up on their
Yeah,
own, or do we want to share
I
them?
think that would be a separate thing in its own. I think it's worth. Yeah,
I've got my David Bentley Hart translation of the New Testament here, just in case. Okay. But yes, you can look them up at home.
it's a homework assignment,
The
and
home,
one
yes,
I
it is
meant
a
to do
home.
myself,
Yeah.
but I didn't.
It would be difficult to enumerate with certainty all the places in Paul's authentic epistles in which he speaks of spirit in so ambiguous a way that it would be impossible to tell whether he means God's or ours. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that there are an enormous number of passages in which it seems plausible that he meant both at once, or sees no need to specify that he means the one rather than the other, because that is, he is speaking about the one reality that is simultaneously God's eternal spirit and also the spirit that abides in us in our innermost selves, breathed into us by God in the beginning of days. See, for example, Romans 5:5, 7:6, 8:2 through 16, 8:23 through 27, 9:1, and 14:17. 1 Corinthians 2:4 to
14:7 for Roman. Sorry,
oh yes,
just for anybody
14:7.
that's following along and wants to look
Yes,
them up.
14:7. 1 Corinthians 2:4, 2:10 through 16, 3:16, 6:17, 14:2, 14:14 through 16, 2 Corinthians 4:13, 6:6 and 6:6, Galatians 3:2 through 5, 4:29, 5:5, 5:16 through 26, 6:8, and Philippians 1:27, 2:1, and so forth. So a significant number of passages there. And of course, such moments are found not only in the authentic epistles. Translations often dissemble the amphibiology, and so doing, and in so doing, perhaps conceal what is most astonishing and mysterious and essential to Paul's vision. But surely this ambiguity is entirely appropriate. The final terminus of the divine descent, the Spirit who descends from the Father by way of the Son to sanctify creatures, is also the initiation of creaturely ascent, the process of sanctification that raises the creature up in the Spirit through the Son to be joined to the Father. Here, just as with the order of being and knowing, so too the order of kenosis and pleurosis, one and the same action, both divine and created, as viewed from inverse perspectives. We are, from the moment when we are called from non-being, spirit becoming spirit. He has spirit there in the lower case, and then spirit in the capitalized. God is from everlasting spirit, disclosing himself in the creation of spiritual beings and the continuous divinization of every spirit that he has breathed forth in breathing himself. And so, in that classic inversion of divine and created spiritual life, where God's creating and sanctifying spirit is also the spirit breathed into the clay from which we are formed, creating the living soul roused from nothingness and drawn into the infinite. There is a place of indistinction that is at once the beginning and the end of both creation and salvation. This is, I think, this is what we were dancing around in our conversation with Wayne,
Mm-hmm.
which actually wasn't one of the passage wasn't not correct. I don't remember exactly what passage, but wasn't the passage that we were
It's
dealing with?
Corinthians. It was in
Wasn't it precisely one of the ones that David cited there in that list?
I believe so. I think. Well, I mean, specifically what Wayne was talking about was the this mirror
Right,
terminology, right? Which
right.
obviously in our in the ways that gets translated as like we're looking on like through a glass, like onto something on the other side versus looking at ourselves, which is a much different kind of idea. And very, I don't know, very interesting. It's kind of, I'm kind of amazed that I haven't noticed this. I hadn't noticed this previously in the text. But as he points out, he says translations, at least, you know, modern translations especially, often dissemble on this, you know, how ambiguous the underlying terminology actually is. It tries to put, you know, a particular explanation into the translation.
Like, what do you mean? Give me an example.
Well, I don't have a particular example.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just, I'm commenting on what
what
he's
David
alluding
said.
to. Yeah, which is, I mean, I have experienced, I think I've gone through most of his translation, and it's, I would say that's the one of the experiences, just how strange the underlying text is, that like rough edges and things that like that just jump out at you as like, oh, that's interesting, but I'd never, you would never have noticed before.
Right. I think even like there's some, do you think though, like that there's even in say theologies that, I know I say theology, let's say in Christian traditions that would not, that might balk at what he's saying here. Don't you think there's still like, there's an understanding of this at some level where there's maybe just like a fear to articulate it?
I don't know. I feel like it's amazing how blinding modernist categorical thinking can be, though, right?
Well, just here, I was thinking if I'm gonna cheat and go ahead a little bit, and it's my job to read the next section anyway. And let's see. In 14, we were both raised in Assemblies of God, right?
Yep.
And the very first thing he says in the next section, is which is section 14. So bulleted item number 14. Actually, it's not bulleted; it's numeral. Romans 8:11 is intelligible only as a confirmation of Genesis 2:7, as well as in another way of Ecclesiastes 12:7. Irenaeus is especially interesting witness to this truth, in part because he appears to have grasped it in an altogether innocent sense, in an altogether innocent sense, the obviousness of its obvious orthodoxy, which in his time and place was apparently largely uncontroversial. If one subtracts the flesh's substance, which is to say, the fashioned clay, and reflects only on the naked spirit, what remains is not the spiritual man, but only a man's spirit or God's spirit. This has been it's funny. This has been obvious to me for as long as I can remember. And it's part of why the fact that the Christianity that I knew growing up, what didn't see that, was part of why I had a problem with it. So that's because that's how I always read. You know, there's there's the hymn, if that same spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwell in you. Like, you know, what do you think you mean when you say that?
Well, I think most people
The
think
same
like,
spirits.
well, I would say, at least this is probably how I probably thought about it under that mode of thinking, is it kind of comes and goes. It's sort of like, oh, in special times and places, you have access to it, not as it is the very foundational component of what causes you to be. Very, very different thinking.
Except for
right?
Genesis 2:7 makes it obvious that it is exactly how you became a living being.
But you can see how the modernist So, I'm thinking, to like, for instance, in Assemblies of God, I went to an Assemblies of God Theological Institute, and they make a lot of course, because so for most of Christians, they think of as this quote unquote baptism of the Holy Spirit as kind of being synonymous with the salvation event itself, whereas for the Assemblies of God specifically, they make a point of saying, okay, it is at the onset of this speaking of tongues is a separate event, which is the quote unquote baptism of that Spirit. So it is, they built into it this sort of kind of special, like bespoke, like thing that happens at a time and a place versus, and even, you think about it, like what's funny is prior to the day of Pentecost, I can't remember which of the Gospels refers to this, but it talks about, Jesus breathes on the disciples and says, receive the Holy Spirit. And yet they don't, they get the sort of promise of it then, but they don't actually have the experience of it until this day of Pentecost, where they say, okay, this is what, we were told to wait for. This is it. And so it's, I think it's kind of in line with this whole being becoming distinction that you were referring to earlier, where it's like there is this already and a not yet kind of element that it's hard for us to, I don't know, to slice without getting too modern and categorical in
I'll
how
tell
we
you what I
want to
think.
describe it.
I think the thing that distracts us from it, I think the thing that keeps people from seeing it the most, let's say in evangelical circles or in Pentecostal circles, where we is to forget. There's a tendency to forget the humanity of Jesus,
Exactly.
and so when you forget the humanity of Jesus, you don't understand quite exactly
Or to make it
what
somehow
that language.
subservient, or
What
like
was
it kind
that?
of like, or to make it somehow subservient, like in such that like you kind of conceive of his humanity as something that like the divine part pops into
Right.
and operates like a puppet,
Yeah, there's a refusal of accepting the actual equality of the Trinity.
Yeah.
And that's not, certainly evangelicals don't have a monopoly on that. Right.
Well,
That's
the
been,
equality of the Trinity is maintained at the cost of like kind of putting this humanity at a kind of a lower level, like just kind of like a temporary space and time sort of like, meat suit that he jumps into versus actually being united to that eternal Spirit.
right. But then what do they think the meaning of the ascension is? Jesus is just going on vacation until the Perusia?
What is the meaning? What is it like? How do you read it? I'm curious, that because I've never been able to. That's always been a.
He's bringing humanity. He's bringing his humanity fully up into divinity. Like it's the completion of the entire process of everything he's accomplished, which he already has accomplished from the foundation of the world, because it's also
Okay. So,
the same
okay.
process by which everything comes into being in the
So,
first
so
place.
so that's an interesting point that you just bring up. Okay, so what happened in time and space and in kind of spiritual reality when that humanity is re-brought up, and is there an actual, like, to use a Barfieldian term, like is there some change in like the overarching spiritual consciousness as a result of that? Because what's
I think
interesting is,
so. I think so. Tomberg talks about that quite a bit.
well, Jesus seems to allude to it himself. Let me just say this real
Yeah,
quickly.
go ahead.
He says it's better for you that I go so
Yes.
that the Spirit can come.
Hmm.
So that it's almost like this sense of like this has to happen before that can happen. So there's some sort of ontological change that is brought into place by that, what you were just referring to there in the ascension.
Well, because we won't learn, because we won't, it's the only way that we can learn that the same, it's the only way that we can learn that the same thing is within us. It's through the Spirit, which is the learning that the divine Spirit, the Holy Spirit, reflects
But
the Spirit that
I
was
feel like you
already
saying
within
it's the only
us.
way we can learn kind of downplays that, but something changed too. Something changed. Something what
Yes.
that was. not possible before were somehow possible. And again, like how do we
I think
mark
it
that?
changed.
How do we
I think it honestly changes history. Tomberg makes a
Mhm,
point that like after 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 Christ, you actually have like these sort of like radiating effects of the passion and the incarnation, the passion and the resurrection and the ascension,
mhm,
where other traditions start to understand themselves in a new way
mhm.
that really starts becoming more Christian. So I mean, one of the traditions that David's always pointing out is um Vedanta, but like it that tradition changes radically in the first century. And I think
Yeah.
Tomberg's right
What
in
and what and
suggesting
who
that
is it?
the reason that tradition changes is because of these radiating effects,
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious, do you think that radiant
because
effect?
Christ is in the world.
Mhm.
He's like in a more full way because of the ascension, like the ascension and the ascension enables him to be with us more fully.
Yeah. I mean, it's just such a different way of looking at it than how I experienced that beforehand. And this makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more uh, I don't know. It's less of a Lego blocks building approach to theology and much more of a like it just feels more intuitive and organic.
Mm.
Um, but it's just so different than how I've
Yeah,
been
me too.
always
Me
seeing this
too.
stuff explained.
Yeah, me too.
And it definitely disrupts that whole image, which is why I think it's so resisted, because it just kind of lights a match and burns all those maps of how things work.
Right, right. Well, because like, what is the? I don't know if I can articulate. I think there's a fear that like somehow here's what I think. I can put a okay. Here's specifically what the fear is. Specifically, what the fear is, in those kind of theological circles is that by recognizing the fullness of the meaning of what you're being created in the image means, that somehow that you are recapitulating the temptation of the garden. But the thing is that to come into realization of that identity only happens through your complete loss of identification with the egoic self that was responsible for falling into that temptation in the first place.
Yeah.
You don't you don't that that egoic understanding of the self is not going to have any place in the kingdom, which is only going to be expanded selves that are fully capable of self emptying to make space for the other so they can be part of the communion of being.
Yeah. But it's not that there's no concern for the self. It's just a different understanding of the self.
No, it's
It's
not that there's no self. It's not,
Yeah.
we're not, that's precisely right. It's not
But
that
I think
there's
that's
no
what
self.
that's how most people think. They think most people, when they feel like anti-egoic, they feel like that's like this sort of like Eastern sort of dissolution of selfhood, that kind of like I'm now like just kind of like
Well, that's because the only self they know is the ego.
yeah.
That's the problem, right? And that is a Western problem. And Eastern teachers that have Western students like will tell you that like we have a strong ego in the West.
Mhm.
That is not the self that is being that is not the self that is in the process of becoming redemption, salvation, whatever word you want to apply to it. That is not, that's the that identification has to go away.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I see this both ways too, because I do think that this possibility in the West of recognizing the individual as being of supreme worth also came out of something of the Christian world that does it makes this incredibly strong case that
Right.
every individual is of ultimate value and it has something absolutely unique and essential for the whole.
But that source of value is that it is loved by God. So it is only in like,
Not just that, but that it actually is.
right,
It is at the ground of its existence. It is him. But
right.
it's a yeah, I know, which
Or comes that
this
it
gets
is
complicated.
sourced in him, let's say. But it is not, you're
I
not just, that's the thing though. But the thing is that like, like this is where I don't think the East, I don't think the phase of the East quite have it right. Because I don't actually think that Atman is Brahman is actually quite it. Because you actually are a real hypostasis that is not the same.
Mhm.
But you, but that is, that is your, but it is your source. It is
Mhm.
your ground. But it has given you the space. It is through its kenotic love, it has given you the space to be another hypostasis. So it's like, it's this understanding of, it's really this is why I push on this idea of personhood as opposed to the individual like so much.
Yeah.
Because like the person, like you don't,
Well,
the person
it's
only exists within those relations.
here's the question, and this is a big question that I don't
Sure,
know
go
we can
for it.
ever
All
solve.
right, we've got like 5 minutes left, but go for it.
Is it possible for this multiplication of the hypostases that you just referred to, is that possible without this problem of evil coming into the fore? Is there something in a certain sense where that actually is a critical component of what makes that possible?
That is a really good question that we should actually, let's have a conversation about that for our next time, because I actually think that's like,
I feel like that's
so
the question, because in some sense, if it's not necessary, then the question is, well,
right,
why is it here? Why is this
right.
allowed?
I think there's a couple things we'll want to bring into that. There's David Bentley Hart's essay that he wrote for Father Kimmel's blog. Let's bring that into the discussion next week.
Okay.
And let's talk about that subject. And then I also have some, I've been reading Bulgakov's Jacob's Ladder on angels, and some of the things that he says in there will be relevant to this, because that he spends a lot of time like talking about hypostasis as it relates to angels, um, and the nature of creaturely freedom and all kinds of things that are actually connected to this. But I would say ultimately my answer is going to be affirmative, and it's going to be related to this idea, to this particular idea of freedom that I'm talking about, this kind of like
Yeah.
existential freedom, where in order to exist in this mode, you had to assent to your own existence.
Right. Let's, I mean, let's just read the next one just so people that are listening can have it, because it kind of
Oh
comments
yeah,
on what we were
because
just
we
talking
touched
about.
on it a little bit. Go for it. Yeah, go ahead
Yeah.
and do it, Mike.
So Romans number 14, Romans 8:11 is intelligible only as the confirmation of Genesis 2:7, as well as of, in another way, Ecclesiastes 12:7. Actually, you read most of this, but he's talking about Irenaeus. And then if one subtracts the flesh substance, which is, this is a quote from Irenaeus, if one subtracts the flesh's substance, which is to say the fashioned clay, and reflects only on only the naked spirit, what remains is not, quote, the spiritual man, but only a man's spirit or God's spirit. Yet, when the spirit is blended with the soul and joined to the fashioned clay, what arises by the grace of the spirit's outpouring is a spiritual and complete man, and it is he, the complete man, who has been created in the image and likeness of God. which is interesting, right? It's this whole thing, the complete man, that is actually the image of God, which is referring to the humanity of Jesus, I think.
Right.
And of course, where there is the Father's Spirit, there is a living human being. Strictly speaking, then, while there are such things as quote unquote spiritual creatures, there really is no such thing as quote unquote as created spirit. By a pardonable and necessary solecism, we speak of created spirits or of a created spirit when we wish to identify discrete hypostases, that is, finite, quote unquote, ensouled and embodied participants in the breath of the Father. But that remains at most a convenient façon de parler, which I think means a mode of speaking.
Mode of speech, yeah.
And then I want to just briefly read the beginning of the next section, because I think this reflects on that mirror imagery again. According to Gregory of Nyssa, when our nature draws near to Christ, it becomes beautiful with the reflection of his beauty. For the soul is a kind of, quote, free and living mirror, end quote, that in gazing upon the face of its lover, the Logos, is adorned with his comeliness. By looking at him, one becomes what he is.
So yeah, this is like this there's a lot of things that I'd like to talk about in connection to this particular avenue of discussion. We can talk about it in the terms of like you were framing it, of like what does this have to say about the problem of evil? Is this sort of process necessary for the kind of like,
Well, because I think that is the question of our age.
real hypothesized spiritual beings to exist? And then the other thing that occurs to me is like part of this has to do with that, particularly that last part from Gregory Nyssa, has to do with the marriage of spirit and soul. Like that's
Yes.
so. And I almost made a comment this morning on the fans of David Bentley Hart page, but then I'm like, nah, I don't have time to track it or get into it. But someone asked a question about the soul, and in connection with this idea of the soul as the soul as Atman, and this sort of like Eastern kind of tradition. And I'm like, I started to say something like, no, that's not the soul, that's the spirit. But I didn't really feel like getting into the weeds. But I really do think like that. But what I started to say is that's the spirit, and what really is going on in our becoming is actually it's a struggle between the fallen body and the spirit to over the soul.
Yeah.
To see which one the spirit's going to conform to.
Interesting.
Which I know sounds very, very Gnostic, but it does. I'll deal with that.
Well, I don't think you it seems like there's certain intuitions that Gnosticism has that absolutely describe our experience of the world.
And also are completely consistent with everything that Paul says.
Yeah, it's replete through the New Testament text. So like there's a reason why, it was persuasive for, early Christian sects. So
yep. And I'm not suggesting any kind of Gnostic doctrines of materiality being evil, but it is the material part of us that's fallen, though.
Mm-hmm.
And the soul is the part that's up for grabs.
And this is all integrated with like, again, the problem of evil, and like trying to understand why is this necessary? Why? And again, I think it's the problem. The question of our age is why most people don't believe in some sort of quote unquote, higher being, is because, well, that to believe that higher being is good doesn't make any sense given, my understanding of the world, and then an omniscient, all powerful being would necessarily have created something much different than what I see.
And what I see, and it's all like, what can I see? What can I measure? Yep. Because where are our eyes? Where are we focused? This came up last time too. So yeah, that's why that's part of the struggle, that's I've obviously ML Bach makes a big deal of that. Steiner seems to understand that. Like a lot of the people we've discussed on Grill Country seem to. I think Barfield gets it.
Yeah. Well, I'd be interested definitely to hear you elaborate, because I think it's still something that is muddy for me. So
Oh
definitely
yeah,
looking forward to that.
let's just talk about that. Let's just put aside the book for a minute and let's talk about that idea, and let's bring in that essay. And I'll bring in some stuff from Bulgakov and we'll talk about it. I think I probably have some stuff from Tomberg too.
Cool. Yeah, I'll
All
look
right.
forward to that.
All right, cool. All right. Talk to you next week.
All right. Take care.